Congress talking about public security in Maré, hosted by Redes da Maré inside the Maré territory itself. That Congress created an important space for dialogue among residents, activists, and researchers, drawing directly on the lived experiences and forms of knowledge produced within the territory. Over the next 2 days, we will expand this conversation to examine how data, evidence, and knowledge shape different forms of intervention, from public security to social policy to digital infrastructures to governance and civic action. In doing so, we bring together community initiatives, public institutions, civic data networks, and researchers working across multiple countries and contexts. Let me begin by acknowledging the organizations that made this event possible. The conference is organized by the InfoCitizen project based at the University of Antwerp in partnership with the Casa de Osvaldo Cruz at the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, Fiocruz, here, the GENI Group for the Study of New Illegalisms at the Fluminense Federal University, and the team of the Public Security and Access to Justice program at Redes da Maré, whose partnership has been fundamental to this Applied Week as a whole. Please join me in welcoming the representatives of these institutions. Luna Arauca, member of the strategic management team at Redes da Maré, working at the intersection of territorial data, public policy, and social advocacy in favela contexts. Please welcome to the stage. Carolina Grillo, professor of sociology at the Fluminense Federal University and coordinator of GENI, whose research focuses on crime, illegal markets, and urban violence. Welcome to the stage. Alexandre Camargo, professor at Casa de Osvaldo Cruz here at Fiocruz and in the Department of Political and Historical Sociology at Cândido Mendes University, whose work examines statistical knowledge, trust in numbers, and the formation of public expertise. Welcome to the stage as well. And I'm speaking here on behalf of InfoCitizen and the University of Antwerp, where I serve as a research professor and the PI of the InfoCitizen project within the Institute of Development Policy. We are deeply grateful to the institutions that have supported this initiative. The conference forms part of the InfoCitizen project funded by the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon Europe program. Additional support for this event has been provided by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Brazil and Paraguay office, the Fundação Chidi Setúbal, the Casa de Osvaldo Cruz and its Department of Research in the History of Science and Health, the Global Engagement Fund of the University of Antwerp, Statistics Portugal, and the GENI at Fluminense Federal University. The commitment of these partners has been essential to enabling this international exchange, so thank you very much. I also want to acknowledge the many people who worked behind the scenes to make this week possible. My sincere thanks to Aloysio Marino, who led the coordination of the conference and worked closely with our partners here in Rio. To Alexandre Camargo for coordinating across Fiocruz and helping secure this remarkable venue. Henrique Gomes, who organized the exchange program with great care. To Maria Paula Nunes for leading the communication strategy and producing the beautiful materials that accompany the conference. To Daniela Linkevicius de Andrade, Alina Kiel, Berta Fernandes Nuez, Guilherme Queiroz Alves, and Thais Gonçalves Cruz for their tireless work over the past months, supporting logistics, partnerships, and the interviews and online engagement during the event. A special acknowledgement to Power 254, whose artistic exhibition accompanies this conference, and I encourage you warmly to visit it just outside the auditorium and entrance during the breaks, and to all those who contributed artwork to the postcards to this conference week. Power 254, Africa's Voices. Please join Center's working group and policy. Thank you very much. Luna Arauca, member my thanks also to Berta and Daniela for curating this collaboration. Working at the intersection of and thanks also to Silvio Ieda and Jennifer Bira Salamula for coordinating production and logistics, managing the many details behind an event like this. I'd also like to thank our moderators and facilitators and the students supporting us throughout the event. And finally, thank you all of GENI, our speakers for being here, and to all of you for joining us in this shared space of exchange. Welcome again. Thank you all. This event would not have been possible without your Alexandre Camargo, professor at Let me close here at initial and in the Department of Political and Historical briefly reflecting on what we hope University, whose work examines statistical knowledge, trust in numbers, and the formation of this conference invites us to think about data not simply as numbers or technical outputs, but as productive. And I'm speaking here on behalf of InfoCitizen and the University of Antwerp, where I serve as a research identities professor and the PI forms of the InfoCitizen project within rather than opposing numbers produced from above by institutions. We are deeply grateful to the institutions that have supported this initiative. We're interested in their encounter forms part the moments when official InfoCitizen project funded by civic initiative.
Protocolos físicos e experiências comunitárias se cruzam.
How data moves across different arenas, from citizen and community knowledge to institutional production and expert analysis to public debate, science and policy, and the Global Engagement Fund of the University of Antwerp. We refer to this broader horizon as informational citizenship. The idea that the commitment of public partners increasingly involves producing and interpreting and mobilizing data. I also want to acknowledge the many people in different territories behind the scenes to make different situated practices. And my sincere thanks to Aloysio Marini. Our hope is that the coordination will allow us not only to speak about our partners, but also to practice new publics, to bring metrics and numbers to Alexandre Camargo for coordinating experience, Fiocruz to welcome methodological and political disagreement, and also to transform Henrique Gomes, who organized the exchange program with great care, evidence making. It's now my pleasure to invite our first speaker for this opening session, Luna Arauca from Redes da Maré, where she serves in the organization's general coordination and also has been deeply involved in initiatives linking community knowledge and public security and data produced in the territory of Maré. Luna, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm a little short, so let me adjust here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have a small responsibility because the person who would speak here was Eliana Silva, the founder of Redes da Maré, so I apologize for this breach of expectation, but I'm going to try to represent Redes da Maré. Some of you met me during the visit to Redes da Maré, but the idea is to speak about Redes da Maré and our data production. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. Let me know about the time. If you don't know Maré, this is the map of our territory. We're talking about 15 favelas crossed by Linha Vermelha, Linha Amarela, and the Brazil Avenue. We always say that Maré is in the heart of the city of Rio de Janeiro because to arrive and to leave Rio de Janeiro, you're going to go through Maré, especially if you come by the Galeão Airport. And we have the buildings of our organization, Redes. We call them equipment. And first, we're going to talk about the territory. Maré is a set of favelas where we have 140,000 residents. According to the Maré census, but IBGE did another census that found 125,000 residents. It's important to say that Maré is bigger than 96% of the Brazilian municipalities. So we're talking about a neighborhood with the size of a city. We have 6 healthcare facilities, 49 schools, two traffic facilities. It is an official neighborhood since 1992. Redes da Maré is a community-based organization. It started in the 1980s with the social movements and grassroots movements. We have an important person for us, Eliana Souza Silva, the founding director and the current director with other 4 directors that we have. She came from Paraíba at 7 years old, escaping the drought, and she arrived in a territory where there's an absence to water. If you want to hear her story from her, I refer you to a podcast called Senta aí Garota, where she tells her whole life story. So, because of her parents, she gets engaged with social movements, and at 22 years old, she's the first woman president of the Homeowners Association of the favela of Nova Holanda. She went to university. She decided to create, with colleagues from Maré, a preparation course for the university to assist the youth that studies in public schools in their preparation to go through the selection exam of universities in Brazil. So she created this preparation course, and now we have other organizations that are part of Redes da Maré today, institutionalized in 2007. It started with an education access with the scores, and then it unfolds into many other work axes. We have 8 work axes. We have the area of education, not only with this preparation course, but also classes of technology, computing, Spanish. We have the axis of right to public security. They are going to talk to you more about this experience later today. It follows the police operations. As you know, the territories of favelas and peripheries are targets of the war on drug. Even though the drugs are distributed throughout the whole Brazilian territory, these are places understood as the places where the repression should happen, even though drug dealers are not inside the favelas. But to question and to produce data on this type of intervention, the Public Security Axis has monitored the police operations since 2016, and they publish a bulletin annually. The 10th edition was launched yesterday at our Congress. We also have the axis of art, culture, memory, and identities. We have an art center, a library, the auditorium where our event happened 2 days yesterday and the day before. It's the only culture facility inside the favela, so we were able to transform it to an auditorium itself, and it is important for socialization and also in the reproduction of the artistic performances that happen in Maré elsewhere. This is a fundamental right that also has to be guaranteed by the residents of the favelas. We had the creation of 2 axes lately, the urban and social environmental axis and the right to health axis. We have some prejudice about this neighborhood. People say that they live in Bom Sucesso, not Maré, to be able to get some work, because when they say they live in Maré, the employer can question if the person will be able to get to work because there are police operations. So we talk a lot about that, about having our own zip codes and being acknowledged as a neighborhood. And the social environmental axis also includes the climate issues like the heat islands and the heat crisis. And as I said, we created recently the Right to Health Access. It was during the pandemic. The last time I came to this auditorium was to talk about the experience of the Right to Health Access. We have a partnership here with Fiocruz, and one of the campaigns that were most prominent and successful was the Vacina Maré campaign. In 4 days, we vaccinated 36,000 people with the first dose of the COVID vaccine, achieving 100% of the population of Maré vaccinated with the first dose. And one of the milestones of vaccination is the territory of Maré till this day. And Maré also has 3 facilities. I'm sorry, the screen. I'm not very good with technology that are transverse into all of our work. Casa das Mulheres, the Black House of the Women's House of Maré, Casa Preta, the Black House of Maré, and the Normal Space, Espaço Normal, that is a space for damage reduction among unhoused drug addicts. These are the axes that Redes da Maré has. Currently, we are 300 weavers, as we call them. These are the workers of Redes da Maré that work in these 13 buildings that you could see in this map with 49 projects. It is a very robust work. This is the methodological basis of Redes da Maré. And then I'm going to go back to knowledge production in a minute, but I'm going to go briefly here on the methodological pathway. The main methodology of Redes da Maré is knowledge production. We have also community mobilization and partnership building, implementation of projects, programs, and actions as experimentation and learning, like a co-creation laboratory, and lastly, advocacy and public policy. As a civil society organization, we understand that our role is not to replace the state, but to summon the state to fulfill its role, to guarantee the rights of the residents. We know that historically, favelas and peripheries are neglected. And when the public policy is enforced, it is also failed. So we need to speak to the public power, to the public administration. And we use these methodological tools to get to the state, to mobilize the population, to do this public debate to guarantee the rights of the residents. This is the impact in numbers of Redes da Maré. But I would like to talk more about data production, which is the topic of the seminar today. These are some of the researches that we have in Redes da Maré. If you want to know more, go to our website, and in the publications tab, you have all of our publications. Here we have the last bulletin of right to public security, the letter of sanitation of Maré in collaboration with Focando, the residents, partners, data lab that is represented here. They were key in the construction of this letter. We had the participatory plan on early childhood in Maré, how these children are having their childhoods affected by the negligence and by the lack of rights, so we should understand their demands. And Censo Populacional, the populational census of Maré, which is our main publication. The Institute of Statistics could not go house to house in Maré, so we knocked on the doors of all the houses in Maré, and we published in 2019 the populational census, which was the only census until 2022. So we have here in our website 12 public security bulletins, the analyses, the political analysis and budget analysis on public policies. We have 22 guides, 37 research studies, and 12 books.
So this is just a summary. And what is the importance of having the civil society organization producing this kind of content? We have this local dynamics because for us to understand this territory, we must understand the details in the dynamics in terms of food safety, food demand, those who are unhoused. So we must understand this reality, and we are producing data for that. And also, we must subsidize public policies due to the lack of them, or maybe because we need to create a new public policy. I heard the sound. I'm sorry. I'm going to end now. So we need to subsidize the public power that many times is not able to get to the territory. The first investigation on food safety in Rio de Janeiro is not entering the favelas. It's only around the favelas. So they don't know what's the situation within the favelas. So now we are producing this food security material about the favela. And we must have this political stance. Grassroots organizations from the favelas, from the periphery, they are able to produce qualified data to subsidize the public debate. This is something that is very much questioned, but in a subtle way. Sometimes the researchers come with some research that they want to only to have data collection with us, or questioning our data, asking if they are really scientific data. So there's all this culture that sees knowledge production only from the spaces like that, Fiocruz and other spaces. Of course, we love to collaborate, but we have our own capacity to produce data locally, and we are showing that with this clear experience by Redes da Maré. So this is helping us to take a stand in the political debate. In the case of the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, we were able to put that in the public debate, this perspective about the favelas territories, and that is going to change the public policy. When we have data to subsidize the public policies locally produced by people affected by that reality, this data will have more quality to create public policies that will really meet the needs of the residents. So if you want to know more about Redes da Maré, we have visits, you have the website. If you want to come and visit our buildings, our partnerships, you may come. We have many problems that we want to solve. These are some of them. And we are always looking for researchers who are willing to co-create with local solutions. I would like to thank you all for attending this Congress, and later on I'm going to answer questions after we end this presentation. Thank you, Luna, for your speech and for the partnership. I'm going to talk in Portuguese, and I'm going to give the floor to Professor Carolina Grillo from GENI. With her very important critical work on data about public security and equality and so on. Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate all the team of InfoCitizen and also the partners from Redes da Maré and Casa de Osvaldo Cruz for their participation and partnership in this event. It's a very happy moment. We have international guests here as well. And the fact that this is happening at Fiocruz is also very important, because I consider this institution the most important one in terms of knowledge production in Brazil. So it's fantastic that we are having this event here. I'm going to be brief, and I organized my speech in 3 parts. First, I'd like to call attention for the importance of public policies based on evidence. The second point is talk about the number relevance, because they are rigid parts of the debate. And the third part is about which numbers are taken into account and who is producing them. So we are living in this moment when we are debating around the knowledge production, and this is a very heat debate because we have the scientific denial context. And many times the debate about public policies is influenced by moral considerations, such as the anti-vaccine movements that will spread fake news, fake information that will hamper the debate, the informed and evidence-based debate. Especially in the field of public security, where I work, we live in this moment where public policies don't take into account the data produced, all the knowledge accumulated about the topic for many decades. And many times they are elaborated with the goal to placate this feeling of unsafety that the population is feeling. So most of the policies in terms of public security are populist policies that will defend the termination of suspects or harder sentences, greater punishment, as if they were efficient ways to fight crime. Although, despite all the evidence that we have that the police lethality and the brutality that didn't produce more safety. So there's a lot of resistance in this field in terms of using data as information sources that will be taken into account when we are formulating a policy. So not only in this field, but in many others, public policies ignore the accumulated knowledge. So in this sense, trying to build knowledge that could improve the public debate that shouldn't be conducted by experts but by the society in general, is that the figures start to have a lot of importance, because the figures, they operate like this rigid denominator. They are apparently neutral, but we know very well this is a mere fiction, because as other forms of data, they are built somehow from the questions that we ask, from the methodologies that we adopt. I'm not saying that they are all fake, but they have a relevance in the public debate because they are able to establish this rigid reference point that is going to inform the debate. That's why so many organizations have been dedicating to produce quantitative data, may they be state bodies, civil society organizations, universities, research centers. We have many actors that are driving this movement of producing data. And back to the field of public security, there's this effort to pressure the state bodies to produce reliable data about their activities, and also from civil society trying to quantify what is not interesting to the state to be quantified. So back to how it happened here in Rio, until the 90s, we didn't have public security statistics. The states, for instance, in Brazil, used data about health. So we had all this effort to create this public security institute in Rio de Janeiro. So in the beginning of the 2000s, we started to have official statistics based on official crime records that enabled us to understand how many people were murdered, how many robbery cases, how many rape cases we had from the criminal records. However, although that was a very important civilization mark in milestone in Rio de Janeiro, the same procedure was adopted in other states, and now we have statistics about public security with more quality, not due to the state body effort, but due to a pressure by the universities and by the civil society so that they produced more data with more transparency, with clear methodology, and yet they don't take into account several different dimensions for those who are living in the city. And from that moment, we started to have several other research studies trying to quantify what was left aside by the official statistics. So I'd like to highlight several statistics on victimization, and this is very important because the criminal records leave many things aside because not all the experiences are happening are being recorded. You could have been robbed and you didn't go to the police station. You could have been raped and not go to the police stations. But in terms of murders, we have a better quality because the sub-notification is happening only in cases of disappearances that are not recorded by as murders. But there are several events that don't come to the official records. So we're having expensive research studying that. That's why they're not so frequent, but they're able to understand what's happening. And several different initiatives started to produce data concerning other experiences that were taken into account before. So, for instance, I'd like to call the attention for this Fogo Cruzado initiative that is our partner in these studies, and they started with shootings in Rio de Janeiro, something that is not recorded in the police. So if someone is killed, is shot, it could enter the official numbers, but the shooting themselves are not recorded. So it's very important to have this initiative by Fogo Cruzado. It's also very relevant, the work that was performed by Redes da Maré, because they started to produce data about the police operations in Maré. Maré is producing data that goes beyond public security because they were able to have the census. They are producing many different kinds of data, but concerning armed violence, it was a highlight in terms of a knowledge production center quantifying operations, number of days that the schools closed, killed people, wounded people, with this volume of data and this data precision that was very good for the territory of Maré. So within this wave of trying to get evidence-based public policies, taking into account the relevant numbers, so that we could have a better public debate and also try and quantify what is not interesting for the official records and official statistics. That's when GENI started to engage in data production using two main research lines. So we have been studying the new legal tools so we have the producing of data on state violence and also about armed groups. So we have some important projects concerning state violence. We have this database about police operations in the metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro, and that enables us to understand how many operations happened, with which goal, with with which motivation, how many dead people, how many wounded people, how many police officers were killed, how many civilians were killed, understanding where, by whom, and with which reason, and what was the impact of that police operation. That's why we were able to create many technical reports for this lawsuit in the Supreme Court concerning the favelas operations in Rio de Janeiro. So based in this police operations, we are producing a specific information about massacres, and the great massacres have more than 8 deaths. And in this sense, we started to create a study in these lines of state violence. We have this very dear project called Mirante that we work with criminal experts, forensic architects, and also other experts to produce evidence in cases of state violence. We work with this cooperation agreement between the Fluminense Federal University and the public defense in the different states to create data about that. And also concerning the armed groups, we, in partnership with Fogo Cruzado, we started to produce data concerning the armed control in Rio de Janeiro using data from our whistleblowing channel, using this map that didn't exist before. So we created this map and we tried to develop this methodology to understand where we have territorial control by armed groups, which armed groups they are, if it's Comando Vermelho and other groups, and mapping the change in the territorial control and by armed groups in Rio de Janeiro. And these data are important for us to have the understanding about the size of this phenomenon, understanding the change, and evaluating the public policies that have been developed to understand this topic. And after decades of police operations in the different territories, we are able to understand that the armed control has been expanding in a systematic way, in an ongoing way, and that is offering us a good measure that these policies are not efficient, despite of the terrible social impacts that we've been contributing for to quantify. They are not being able to curb the advance of this armed control. So I think my time's up, but I'm anxious to listen from the other participants and other experiences concerning data production. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol, for your very important speech and also for cooperating with GENI. I'd like to invite Professor Alexandre Camargo, who represents Casa de Oswaldo Cruz at Fiocruz, our host. And Fiocruz is one of the most important public institutions concerning research, science, health, and public policy. Alexandre, the floor is yours. Thank you, Moisés. Good morning, everyone. It's a great joy to be here, being able to have this event here at Fiocruz. InfoCitizen has launched the cornerstone, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to have this institutional speech. After all, I'm representing Fiocruz and Casa de Oswaldo Cruz at this table, and I'd like to thank them for the support so that this event could happen here in Biomanguinhos, especially to the Department of Research on Science and Health and our Professor Gisele Sangala, who is present here. I'd like to thank her so much. And it's a great joy as well because I'm part of the InfoCitizen. I started 2 years ago with them when the project started, and I was able to build the bridge between these initiatives and institutions from data production and the logics of data production that we've been experiencing in the last years and that is going to go on in the near future, not organizing in the state and its organizations, but including data labs, social collectives in this bottom-up approach. So what does that mean in terms of social transformation and democratic participation? And also in terms of redefining the statistic work by state agencies.
Not only taking account the need to hear the social movements and their demands, but having a more a closer collaboration, forming networks of collaboration with communities, territories, and collectives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this because, above all, I would like to thank the approval of the recognition of learning outcomes, RRA. This is a project that was carried forward by Fiocruz because that was what guaranteed that there would be no strike this week. Because if that happened, we wouldn't be here today. If the strike happened, we wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't have the joy to share this opening session with Luna and Carolina and Moises. It is very important that this discussion is made here. Fiocruz, as many of you know, but not in from a lot of detail, Fiocruz is one of the main scientific knowledge institutions in the country, and it is affected exactly by the topic of this event. Both by the line of enhanced concept of health adopted by the WHO since the beginning of the century, that says that health is not the absence of diseases or illnesses. Health is a complete well-being. It depends fundamentally on the person's full development and all the access to rights, including the right to inclusion. So discussing violence is discussing health. Discussing inequality is discussing health. But much more than that, Fiocruz historically is called Complex of Manguinhos, formed by Fiocruz and the territories of Manguinhos. It is an indivisible unit. Fiocruz is not only a state agency, but an agency that historically, before becoming a trend, even before becoming a trend, was engaged with the reality of the territories ever since the 20th century. And at least since the 1990s, we have been building several different forms of collaboration and dialogue with interventions and community development. Just to mention some of these initiatives that date back to the 1960s with the Favelas Theater, but more recently, since 1990, with the preferential hiring of the residents of this complex of favelas. Ever since the beginning of the Museum of Life, we hired monitors who lived in the communities. More recently, we had the projects of scientific education and environmental education. We welcome the schools inside the space of Fiocruz. It is absolutely open and it is attended by students and researchers and people seeking health services. We have access. That is the most important part. We have access given to all of the residents of the favelas of Manguinhos. And many other initiatives like income generation projects, violence reduction projects, cultural exhibits that culminate in the citizen-led data generation project for the promotion of health. This is going to be the topic of one of the roundtables in the afternoon. This project, citizen-generated data, that started in 2021, is directly related to the pandemic as an inflection point for data production in general. I think everybody knows about it, but Fiocruz was a protagonist not only in the manufacturing of vaccines, but the consolidation of the protocols of fighting against COVID, the preventive protocols, and in the reaffirmation of a scientific culture to deal and to handle the problem of the health crisis. But in addition to that, the pandemic, from the standpoint of data production, also represents in Brazil, in the Brazilian experience, a very important milestone that shows us a mismatch of data production. The national government took initiatives like, for example, what was called the dashboard of life, trying to show the number of cured people and instead of the number of deaths, trying to show what kind of good was done during that time. And then the attempt to change the criterion of dissemination of cases and deaths to consider not only the compilations throughout the week, but considering only the days considering the individual days. They did not show a compilation of the week anymore. They showed data according to days. Lots of people called it a type of revisionism, and it had an effect of decredibilizing the work of the federal government. People no longer trusted this data that were completely biased by the government. So what happened was we had a key experiment formed by a series of universities, civil networks, and media outlets to found a structure of quantitative information with the reputation and credibility to keep alive the data production and the trust in on the data on health. So Fiocruz was leading this process, but the data labs, the collectives, and the territories were also very important. During the pandemic, these data labs and these networks, they expanded their activities to try to fulfill the health protocols and to try to find the possible social distancing that was able to be enforced inside some territories. These networks got to know the real difficulties in fulfilling with the health protocols inside territories like the favelas and the communities. So when the state cannot get to the territory, we have this horizontal data production that we are prioritizing here in this event. The collectives organize and they close the gap of official registration, official recording of data for health promotion, to enforce also protocols like the WHO protocols. In this case, we see, when we look at the numbers, the data produced in this community-led initiative, we can call this practice an insurgent practice. It is insurgent because it is not only about closing a gap that the state left, but it's also about the way that we compile the figures and we generate the data. Many initiatives here go way beyond Brazil and Palestine and Africa, in Colombia and Brazil. We're dealing with numbers that affect directly the people that produce this data. The case of feminicides, of volunteers or activists that are engaged in data production, cases that are not mentioned by the state, that are not recorded. A data compiler of the Institute of Statistics or another institute could be not so sensitive to this kind of data. So we need to take into account the experience of suffering. This kind of data is also a way to make things visible, but it's also a way to make the cases visible, but the suffering visible as well. There's an ethical care in the way that this data is generated. These initiatives should be analyzed and taken into account and empowered in the sense of financing. This type of data generation that we saw during the pandemic includes memory and affection. We take into account not only the collective data, but individual data as well, in a way that we are sensitive to the datafication and quantification of the suffering. So dealing with this tension, dealing with the desingularization that statistics represents, demands a careful look on the territory. This is the challenge, how to deal with the desingularization of statistics and still pay attention to the sensitive perspectives of data. We don't want to avoid capturing the needs that these people and these community collectives have, using a logic that is not indifferent to them. I'd just like to wrap it up by saying what we can learn with the localized data production experiences. I'll finish in 2 minutes. We give up on methodological positivism, which is still very present in institutional ethos. Neutrality, political neutrality, objectivity in the sense that it is possible to keep objectivity in favor of engagement. Universality as well is the third point of this triad, often understood as a uniformization. When we talk about the local data production, we're talking about diversity. We're talking about diversification of data. In these 3 cases, we see that numbers are not cold. Numbers can lead to outrage. Numbers are not impersonal. Numbers can represent grievance, can give rise to demands for justice. The data does not generate automatically mobilization and sensitization. The power of these figures depends on how they're produced and who produces them, how they're mobilized through narratives and networks of solidarity. And that all depends on giving meaning to the numbers, to impersonal numbers, and turning them into biographies as an expression of singular lives. Accounting for data also involves emotion, involves proximity. census workers, they have to be sensitive to situations of extreme poverty, women that undergo assault and feminicide. This type of horizontal data has to have affection. This shows us that there are interfaces among the quantification interfaces of the state and the social collective, despite their differences of scale, authority, financing. And there has to be a conversation to produce greater legitimacy, participatory legitimacy in case of the state statistics, and how to avoid the lack of trust on data caused by revisionism in the case of the governmental statistics, and how we can avoid the political criticism in the case of data produced by the collectives. It is important that we focus on the groups that suffer the most violence in territories. I think these are some of the questions and some of the issues that we can debate throughout the next 2 days. I think they can help us make up a world with better data production and more horizontal data production. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandre, for the words.
As you can adjust. I want to also say a few words on behalf of the InfoCitizen project. I'd like to share a few reflections on the kind of research agenda that brings us together here today, and on how this conference fits within a broader set of conversations about data, about knowledge, and democratic life more broadly. So the work we are developing at InfoCitizen forms part of a wider effort to understand how data and quantification are reshaping the meaning of citizenship across contemporary societies. We are living in a moment when data ecosystems are expanding rapidly, but also becoming increasingly contested. So over the past decades, controversies around data have become central to democratic life. We see this in debates around population censuses, migration statistics, public health data, security indicators, and digital infrastructures. Data has become one of the key arenas through which societies define who counts, what exactly counts, and how collective problems are understood and governed. But these transformations are unfolding in a world that's increasingly on edge. We are witnessing the proliferation of misinformation, the circulation of fake news, the politicization of expertise, and the weaponization of algorithms. At the same time, vast new data infrastructures are being built, producing unprecedented volumes of information about populations, territories, and everyday life. In this context, data can be mobilized in very different and sometimes also contradictory ways. For example, it can be used to deepen surveillance and exclusion and marginalization, but it can also be used to expose injustice, to document violence, and build new forms of accountability. So data deluges coexist with profound data absences. Understanding these tensions requires us to think about data not only in terms of its politics, but also in what we call in the project its poetics. We've come to know a lot about how institutions and infrastructures and power relations shape the production and circulation and the use of numbers. But data also carries a poetic dimension. Numbers do not only measure reality as such, they also shape how societies come to imagine themselves, how futures are projected, and how experiences ultimately become legible, meaningful, or sometimes invisible. Data carries aspirations, anxieties, and moral claims. It can generate new forms of recognition and belonging, but it can also reproduce exclusions and silences. Today, data is no longer being produced exclusively by states and expert institutions, as we have come to know, of course. Across very different contexts, we see communities and grassroots organizations and civic initiatives creating their own forms of data and numbers, sometimes to complement official statistics, sometimes to challenge them, sometimes to simply make visible realities that would otherwise remain uncounted. Citizens and institutions are increasingly interacting around the production and the interpretation and the circulation of data. So this broader agenda has led us in InfoCitizen to speak of informational citizenship. Today, it makes little sense to think of official statistics and citizen-generated data as completely separate worlds. What we see instead are complex data ecosystems where state infrastructures and expert knowledge and civic initiatives and community practices intersect in multiple ways. Understanding these entanglements is essential if we want to understand also how contemporary societies govern questions around inequality and recognition and belonging. It also requires us to think about data as a multi-dimensional phenomenon. Data is not only technical, as we all know, it's also deeply political and social, historical, and affective. It shapes how institutions make decisions, how communities articulate claims, how publics imagine the future, and also how societies recognize or sometimes fail to recognize different forms of experience. So for this reason, research must increasingly also follow data across multiple scales, from community documentation and everyday practices of counting to national statistical systems and institutional networks of expertise, to international policy debates and transnational networks. Bringing these different contexts into conversation opens up important possibilities for learning across regions and experiences. Too often, debates about data circulate primarily within north-to-north frameworks of expertise. But many of the most innovative experiments that we see today around participatory data and citizen documentation and community-driven statistics are actually happening in the Global South. This creates an opportunity not only for south-to-north exchanges, but also for south-to-south learning across different societies facing related challenges around inequality, around representation, and visibility. So at InfoCitizen, we don't just look at the Global South as a set of empirical case studies, but we think of it as a powerful epistemological vantage point, a space from which to rethink how data ecosystems operate in conditions of inequality, institutional fragility, and rapid technological transformation. These contexts reveal dimensions of data that often remain invisible in more institutionalized environments. They help us think through the multidimensional character of data ecosystems in a world on edge, where infrastructures of measurement and everyday survival strategies and political claims as well as technological experimentation coexist in complex ways. Here, we want to begin in this conversation, in this space, to open up these sorts of reflections by bringing together researchers and the civic initiatives, public institutions and community organizations working in very different contexts, but grappling with similar questions. How do we produce data that reflects lived realities? How do we ensure that numbers do not just erase experiences? And how do we build data systems that support democratic accountability rather than reinforce existing inequalities? A key dimension of this agenda concerns how we communicate and experiment with data itself. At InfoCitizen, we also have been exploring new ways of translating research into formats that allow broader publics to engage critically with data. So one example I want to briefly show here is the series of interactive visualizations that we recently launched on the InfoCitizen website, which you have the QR code, by the way, in the program. So these visualizations, they're not simply tools to present results, but we think of them as experimental research methods as well. So through interactive maps, for example, and narratives, we try to invite users to explore the political histories, the institutional debates, and the epistemological tensions embedded in statistical categories and experiences of making and circulating numbers. So one of the pilot tools, one of the pilot tools developed by Aloisio, for example, maps how around 60 countries in the world classify or choose not to classify sometimes ethno-racial categories in their statistical systems. We have another tool, or better, an interactive experience developed by Daniela as well, which invites users to explore what an ethno-racial variable actually looks like or is in practice through a simulated dialogue with artificial intelligence. So rather than presenting data as neutral, these tools try to make visible the historical decisions, the political struggles, and the institutional negotiations that shape how data categories actually end up coming into existence. And in this sense, they also carry pedagogical ambition. They aim to foster what we might call critical data literacy. So data literacy here is not just simply thought as a tool or perhaps a capability for reading numbers. It's also about creating spaces where different actors, from citizens to researchers to activists and institutions, can actually engage in shared practices of producing, interpreting, and debating data itself. This is especially important in the democratic moment we inhabit. Trust in numbers cannot be imposed from above. Neither can it be sustained in isolated grassroots initiatives alone. It must be built from both sides through processes in which institutions learn from situated knowledge and community experience, while civic initiatives gain visibility, recognition, and broader circulation. Approaching data in its multidimensionality opens up new pathways for this kind of exchange. It can enable more inclusive and sustainable policymaking, closer collaboration between experts and citizens and activists, and new forms of trust in science and public knowledge. It is within these spaces that new publics can ultimately begin to emerge. Publics capable not only of questioning numbers, but of collectively producing and inhabiting them in more accountable, reflexive, and democratic ways. Which brings me to the end of this opening reflections. So again, over the next 2 days, we hope that this conference will offer a space to explore together the many dimensions of contemporary data ecosystems. So how numbers are actually produced, contested, circulated, and inhabited across different institutions, communities, and territories. At a moment when data is increasingly central to democratic life, but also increasingly contested. Creating spaces for dialogue across these different forms of expertise becomes more important than ever. Let me once again thank you our partners, the speakers, and the participants for being part of this collective effort. With that, I would like to formally open the InfoCitizen Applied Conference and wish you all 2 days of stimulating discussions and exchanges. Thank you very much. We will now take a 1 minute or so brief moment to reorganize the table before we move into the launch of the policy report and the book Numbers in Action. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's now start our lunch section of the policy report and the book Numbers in Action. Yeah, two publications that kind of accompany this event and the broader work of the InfoCitizen project as well. So beginning with the policy report, which you can easily access on the QR code, now displayed on the screen. And the second lunch is of the Portuguese language book Números em Ação, Numbers in Action, which we will introduce also in this session. So both of these publications, they emerge from the same broader research agenda and from many of the collaborations and conversations that we have that have brought us together here this week. The policy report grows directly out of the encounters we have been fostering through the InfoCitizen project over the past years. And an important point I want to make here as well is that rather than presenting a single model or a set of ready-made solutions, the report tries to reflect on what happens exactly when different actors who work with data, be those community organizations or public institutions, researchers, and civic initiatives, come into contact with one another. What tensions arise in this process, what opportunities open up, and what responsibilities emerge when different ways of producing evidence begin to interact. So the goal is quite practical. It's basically to offer a shared language for thinking about these encounters and to highlight some of the institutional, political, and ethical questions that arise when data becomes a central tool for documenting realities and making claims and informing public decisions. So at the center of the report, we have developed 4 commitments that guide how we approach these questions. The first one being that data is inherently political. The second commitment that categories are always contested, situated, and lived. The third commitment being that visibility is a double-edged process. And the fourth commitment concerning the Global South as an epistemological spine for thinking about data today. So building on this commitment, the report takes us through a simple but important process, an important journey. It starts with the basic question, who gets to count in and our societies? So today it's not just governments producing data, as we know. Communities are also counting and documenting realities that are often ignored, challenging official numbers or filling in the gaps. So the key challenge is not choosing one over the other, but finding ways for these different forms of knowledge to actually speak to each other. From there, the report asks what happens when lived experience meets statistical categories. Because people are not just collecting data, they're also reshaping how reality is measured in the process. They are turning everyday experiences into evidence that can travel into courts, into policies, and public debates. But this also creates a new tension, because making things visible can also create new risks. The same data that helps expose injustice can also lead to surveillance or stigmatization. So producing data is never just technical. It's also about protection, about strategy, it's about responsibility. And this leads us to a final shift in perspective. So instead of looking only from traditional centers of expertise, the report turns to places where these tensions are already very real. What we call the Global South is not just a set of examples, it's a place where we can learn how data, inequality, and power actually interact in everyday life. So the aim here is not to propose a single model, as I said, something to be replicated, but rather a compass, a set of orientations that can help policymakers and researchers and civic organizations and communities to navigate the complex realities of data-driven governance today. So taken together, the report advances an important argument, which is that in a world increasingly organized and contested through data, democracy depends not only on producing more data, but on building the sort of institutions and safeguards and collaborations that ultimately shape how data is able to travel across scales, and contexts, and who gets to define its meaning. So to help us reflect on some of these questions, we are very fortunate to have with us Jeffrey Rubin, professor of history at Boston University, who actually wrote the afterwords of this report. So Jeffrey's work has long explored how scholarship can connect knowledge, social movements, and public engagement. And his reflections in the report help us situate it within a broader conversation about research and intervention and democratic life. Jeff, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Moises, and the InfoCitizen team and the others sponsoring these events for your work and for including me in it. InfoCitizen seeks to make data systems legible as political arrangements and to take seriously the lived, contested, and creative work of data representation. In doing this, what jumps out from the cases under discussion is the immersion of the researchers and activists in the locations where they work or live, how deeply they know and seek to know collaboratively and in different ways specific places. These data activists and social movements actively engage the poetics of data representation. It is how they do that and with what awareness and sensibility that makes this project so compelling. Their descriptions of neighborhoods and organizations insist on complexity in the locations of daily life, multiplicity in what data is and how it is gathered, myriad possibilities of how to use data, and intricacies of engagement with those holding more or other kinds of power. The sensibility I want to use to frame InfoCitizen's work offers a toolkit for perceiving and acting amidst these kinds of multiplicity. What I call seeing and not seeing has been developed by a post-disciplinary seminar at Boston University consisting of scholars across the humanities and social sciences in dialogue with activists and scholars from the US, Latin America, and Europe, including InfoCitizen's research team. Seeing and not seeing offers 4 sets of practices for producing knowledge and acting amidst multiplicity: seeing, representing, dwelling, and intervening. By not seeing, in the seeing and not seeing label, we mean looking squarely at, seeing, but also beyond and through the big things that people habitually see and are primed to see, such as police, acts of violence, religious practices, bodies, economies, or borders. By resisting habitual moves to coherence and boundary making, a seeing and not seeing sensibility works to identify the multiple processes, forces, and representations that occur inside and around the actors and events we usually see. This means opening ourselves to multiple forms of seeing, multiple forms of sensing. It means developing practices that press us continually to sense more, to know that around and inside what we initially see, there are other processes and phenomena that constitute the reality that we seek to change. The projects described in Section 2 of this report on bridging lived categories and policy intervention begin with these forms of seeing and not seeing, so as to discern frequencies and locations of violence, impacts of favela landscapes on consciousness, and physical and emotional threats to the survival of female refugees. Each of these projects asks, how can communities build instruments of knowledge and accountability when they are miscounted, rendered invisible, or made legible only through harmful frames? To pursue these goals, the activists in these projects know that they need to see and see again and sense behind and inside what appears to be in front of their eyes. So the first recommendation of the Seeing and Not Seeing Toolkit is to develop collaboratively in the locations where people live practices of sensing multiplicity suited to that place and the experiences of those who live there, as many of you know and are already doing. The seeing and not seeing sensibility suggests that to describe the world and seek to change it, representations need to build into themselves the multiplicity made visible by different ways of seeing. Representations of data, need to let us know that there are things behind and around the images they offer. This was illustrated in a striking way by 16th century Italian painter Caravaggio, to take us in a somewhat different direction. Caravaggio's artistic innovation was his ability to render figures on a canvas in a way that let viewers feel instantly that the figures possessed depth. There were things behind the figures on the canvas. The sense of depth also communicated to viewers the painter's doubt, his struggle to represent a complex reality in an artificial frame, as many of us struggle. Finally, Caravaggio depicted in his paintings people so alive in their interactions that viewers thought instantly of models in a studio somewhere nearby, knowing that what they saw in the painting or in the data was a doubling of the reality of the models or the community. So depth, doubt, and doubling. This is what representations, including data representations, can do when they play with the multiplicity that seeing and not seeing makes visible. In this way, even when specific crucial pieces of information are transmitted through representations, sites of violence, impressions on the way to school, counts of trash collection, this occurs in a way that holds open further interpretation. In 1994, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, created and elaborated this kind of living poetics of representation, bringing together images of indigenous Maya, masked rebels, a radical bishop, vast deprivation, and the North American Free Trade Agreement in a way that captivated Mexicans. Partly as a result of this representational resonance, following on decades of on-the-ground organizing by clergy, clandestine leftists, and indigenous activists, the Zapatista rebellion survived the onslaught of the Mexican army. The representations generated by InfoCitizen and the many collaborators in the project indicate depth, suggest doubt, remind viewers of the tension between representation and reality, and acknowledge the arbitrariness of the frame, suffused as it is with complex layers of power. So the second recommendation of the Seeing and Not Seeing Toolkit is that community activists and researchers play with the poetics of data representation to discover ways of representing ambiguity and depth in particular locations and struggles. The third component of the Seeing and Not Seeing Toolkit is to hold and dwell in multiplicity. This is the slowing down that the projects described in this text recommend and practice. The very act of not seeing, of looking around and through the conventional objects in front of our eyes, provides spaces for holding, which in turn allows us to discern the play of things around us. What does it mean to slow down and dwell in multiplicity? Dwelling in multiplicity means sustaining it over time, living amidst words, sounds, images, and experiences. This is what Africa's Voices does as a long-term listener, holding people's words, frustrations, and expectations after conversations end. In this process of dwelling, people remember previous conversations and ask what has changed. They begin to discern how lived experience might produce interventions that travel further into systems that are rarely designed to listen. The projects with which InfoCitizen collaborates happen in the places where people already dwell and build houses. Afrozensis practices dwelling and holding, for example, when it brings research to the community's table, transforming research encounters into spaces of co-theorizing about everyday racialized interactions. Today, we will hear about dwelling in numerous projects, including Redes da Maré's community census and violence monitoring. As Africa's Voices suggests, holding and listening means being willing to sit with what is difficult and unresolved. This is where learning takes place. The third lesson in the Seeing and Not Seeing Toolkit is to develop practices of dwelling in and holding multiplicity that can be repeated and played with, even in situations of great harm and called upon in moments of crisis. Sensing and holding multiplicity, as InfoCitizen projects do, brings access to intimacy through interactions with people and daily experience. In addition to attuning us to place-based knowledge, furthermore, a seeing and not seeing sensibility brings our sustained attention to the ways in which actors and forces interact at different scales. And here I'm talking about intervening. In turn, examination of the supply chains linking intimacy and scale suggest nodal points of openness and vulnerability in complex systems. This is a way to see where effective action might take place. The IBGE census reform proceeded because civil society activists, as well as professionals within IBGE, discerned key nodal points in a government agency and process, making it possible to alter statistical categories. The Africa Voices Foundation uses interactive radio programs, platforms, and digital tools to discern patterns in dispersed citizen voices and transform them into structured evidence. The Seeing and Not Seeing toolkit enables activists to make use of the practices described above, or that I've just described, seeing, representing, and dwelling, to intervene in the world, to reduce harm and increase well-being and equality. First, this means sensing the world and gathering data with the awareness that there is always more to see around and through what we see most readily. Second, it means representing the data we gather by making visible and palpable the depth and doubt that accompanies knowing the world. Third, it means bringing to activism the ongoing experience of holding and dwelling so as to discern patterns and connections not initially visible. The fourth lesson of the Seeing and Not Seeing toolkit is that interactions of intimacy and scale, gained primarily by deep immersion in particular places, bring into focus locations of vulnerability in complex systems. This is the sort of data gathering and representing of data and dwelling and intervening that the projects in this report enact and sustain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for these valuable and important words. So please take a look at the report. The QR code is on the screen. I also want to call back Alexandre to the stage. We also now will proceed with the lunch part of the policy of the book Números em Ação, which is a book that's published by Tech in Portuguese and brings together a group of scholars working across anthropology, sociology, science and technology studies, and who share a common concern, trying to understand what numbers actually do in social life. Because numbers, as we have been discussing here over the week, and also in the beginning of this conference, they are not just there to describe the world, they also exist to intervene in it. So across the chapters of this book, which range from public health and genetics to economic regulation to statistics and social inequality, we follow numbers in motion, how they circulate, how they stabilize certain interpretations of reality, and how they ultimately acquire the authority needed to intervene in public debates. Seen from this perspective, quantification is not simply a technical activity, it's also, as we have been discussing, a form of action. Counting and classifying, comparing and measuring, these are practices through which societies define problems, allocate resources, establish priorities, and ultimately imagine possible alternative futures. And that's precisely why the book speaks so directly to the broader conversations and questions that bring us together in this conference. Because one of the central challenges we face today is that we're living, as I said in the beginning, through two important transformations at the same time. On the one hand, we're experiencing an unprecedented expansion of data. Numbers are everywhere, as we know, in governance, in markets, digital infrastructures, scientific research in everyday life. But at the very same time, we are also witnessing something else, a growing uncertainty about the authority of numbers themselves. Statistics are contested, indicators are debated, data circulates in environments shaped by misinformation, disinformation, political dispute, and institutional distrust. And in this context, numbers become both objects of struggle and tools for imagining alternatives. One of the arguments that we develop in the opening chapter of Números em Ação is that numbers should not be treated as neutral mirrors of reality. They're better understood as operators of worlds, devices through which realities are stabilized, contested, and sometimes transformed. Numbers are never simply technical outputs. They're embedded in institutions and in infrastructures and publics. They circulate through bureaucracies, scientific laboratories, policy debates, media controversies, and community initiatives. And as they move through these arenas, they help shape how societies come to understand inequality, citizenship, risk, and belonging. In this sense, the book resonates strongly with the broader research agenda of InfoCitizen. Because if we look at informational citizenship as being about the growing ways in which participation in public life involves engaging with data, producing it, interpreting it, contesting it, then understanding how numbers are made, how they travel, and how they gain credibility becomes a central task. Números em Ação situates Brazil within this broader conversation about the social life of quantification. But it also suggests something important for the global debate. The Brazilian experience, with its dense interactions between official statistics, academic research, civic initiatives, and grassroots data practices, offers a particularly powerful vantage point for understanding the transformations we're witnessing today. In other words, Brazil is not simply a case study. It's a place from which we can rethink the role of numbers in contemporary societies. And that's exactly why it felt so relevant to launch this book today, here in this conference, in dialogue with the conversations that are going to unfold throughout the 2 days. With that, I would like to invite Alexandre also to briefly give an overview of the book and the contributions that it brings to this collective efforts of understanding numbers, not only as measurements, but also forms of social action. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jeff, also for those reflections.
Thank you. I'm just
Portuguese, so if you need to switch your headphones, please.
I will just add to Moises' speech. This book has 2 great projects. The first one is academic, and the other one is ethical and political. Academically, we tried to gather for the first time the first collective publication about this field of studies of quantification in Brazil made by Brazilian researchers with research about Brazil. And from Brazil's position, we tried to build parameters for a Latin American agenda to think globally about the quantification processes. Is no longer just academic. We should establish what it is possible to consider when we think about the Global South and Latin America, not only as a repository of empirical cases to feed Eurocentric theories, but also as a way to have an epistemological laboratory with new experiences to quantify and datify, which we're going to discuss today and tomorrow. This is an important point, this innovative characteristic. Academically, we also have the intention to show no longer the social life of numbers, but how the numbers react, how the numbers travel, and when they travel, they are translated, they are reappropriated, and we want to analyze what is lost in this process, either by distortion or by any other phenomena that the data go through in this travel. We start the book. We follow the ethical political line, meaning that the data is not technical or cold or neutral. They are actually moral instruments. They are a reflection of our sense of belonging. They're a reflection of our community, society projects. We try to understand the universe of numbers. It is the biggest universe of all, usually made by experts, but it is actually possible to understand numbers in a different way. We have the statistical agencies. The first 3 chapters of the book are about the statistical agencies, the production regime of government statistical agencies, and it helps us understand how in these laboratories there are some imperatives for data generation. The intangible imperatives, not only the formal written imperatives, but we also try to understand how people respond to the protocols, which are very strict protocols that sometimes are unattainable. So we understand how adaptations to numbers are done, and even with all of that process, we have reliable data at the end. We also understand what is necessary for figures to be understandable. This is addressed in the opening chapter, as Moises talked to you about, how we make data reliable and trustworthy, and how we maintain this trustworthiness of numbers. The book has 4 volumes. Has 4 chapters. The 3rd chapter is about health and genetics. The 4th chapter is about citizenship. And there's a chapter about economics. That is how we can give an overview, a very comprehensive overview on the social life of numbers. When we talk about citizenship and inequality, we talk about quantification as insurgence, quantification as visibility, how quantification moves around this tension between government practices of quantification and the alternative records, and what the alternative records intend to do. Why should they be taken seriously? When we talk about inequality and citizenship, we have a text about the trajectory of indigenous-led data as a methodological category, and its sociopolitical implications. This indigenous-led data can only be understood by understanding what it is to be indigenous. In the beginning of the 20th century, we need to analyze how the category of indigenous was created, and the data understands how this evolved, this category evolved, the new claims and the new needs, the new place for the indigenous population. There is a reflective characteristic in terms of the different categories of data. Categorizing a populational group implies and affects the way that this group sees itself, and affects the way that the whole society sees this group, and its role in the construction of society. We also have a specific chapter for police operations written by Carolina, that was here with us, Carolina Grillo, that was here with us in the opening session. And ending this chapter, we have a text about the quantification of conflicts in the field, how how reports are produced, reports by the pastoral institution of the earth, and how they're taken to the state.
And how they are accompanied by narratives, affection, and morality. And then we have a discussion on health and genetics, where we have a different proposal, because it's a proposal of dialogue with the science institutes, where the numbers in this literature are connected to the legal evidence and their regime, so biometric evidence, for instance. So how the hidden aspects subjacent to the numbers are revealing subtle aspects that are not taken into account, but we must understand them, because we must understand how this biometric evidence is built and used. So we have Hansen's disease that has been counted and treated from numbers, and also the Zika virus epidemic and the case of the DNA database for forensic analysis. And to end, we have this last session talking about numbers in economics, how the future market operators and market mediators are using this data. And these numbers are mediators of the future and economic crisis. The crises are built based on the numbers collected, and what are the expectations of chaotic futures that could come from the figures. So we have a tax on inflation indicators, we have tax on how the charts and percentages establish sense about competition in the market, what competition is, what is legal, what's not, what is a legal competition and what is not a legal competition, and how the chart's aesthetic is changing this perception. And we have this text basis on Moises' thesis that was written not long ago about a very dear topic today, that is the statistical construction of this new middle class, how it was constituted as a key category using quantification practices. It's a book that was written by sociologists and anthropologists, but is gathering texts that are reflecting about social and historical aspects that have this format to be debated during these 2 days. So I hope you like it and approve it. Thank you, Alexandre, for your words. Just to end this session, we've worked a lot in the last months to be able to bring a number of copies here to this conference. So we also have OCITEC with us. Ensuring that we will have the right number of copies in this event. Now we are going to have the panel picture, and then we are going to have the opening keynote. I just wanted to add something to my speech, because in reality there are some people with us and they have some questions that are in the chat box. So now we are not answering the questions, but we ask you to wait a little bit, and please repeat the questions in the Q&A sessions that we are going to happen during the panels, and also in the conference that is going to happen now.
Obrigado, Moisés.
Thank
Obrigado,
you,
Alexandre.
Moisés. Thank you,
Obrigado,
Alexandre. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Claro. Obrigado. Bom dia a
Thank you.
todas e todos.
Good morning, everyone.
We're going to switch back to English.
So you can adjust there. My name is Guilherme Queiroz Alves. I'm also a PhD researcher, part of the InfoCitizen team. And it is with great, great honor that I initiate and I welcome here for us to start the keynote speech. And without further ado, for our opening keynote, we are honored to welcome Nanjala Niabola. Nanjala Niabola is a Kenyan writer, researcher, and political analyst. Her work focuses on the intersection between technology, media, and society. She holds a BA in African Studies and Political Science from the University of Birmingham, a Master's in African Studies, and a Master's in Forced Migration, both from the University of Oxford, as well as a GED from Harvard Law School. She has held numerous research associate positions, including with the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Overseas Development Institute, the Oxford Internet Institute, and other institutions, while also working as a research lead for several projects on human rights broadly and digital rights specifically. She's the author of Digital Democracy, Analog Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya, published in 2018. Traveling While Black, Essays Inspired by a Life on the Move, published in 2020. And Strange and Difficult Times, Notes on Global Pandemic, published in 2022. And she's going to be talking today, and the title of her presentation is Beyond Representation, How Can African Feminism Enrich the Ethics of Our Shared Digital Future? Nanjala, thank you so much. I'd also like to invite Brian Gemza, who will be moderating this panel here with us. Please, Brian. Our moderator is a professor at Texas Tech University and an affiliate of the InfoCitizen research team at the University of Antwerp. His interdisciplinary work spans climate communication, public history, and the study of disinformation in AI, with a focus on strengthening civic and media literacy in the digital age. He directs the Creating Livable Futures initiative and collaborates with students, researchers, and industry partners to address real-world challenges related to information integrity, complex systems, and community resilience. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here with us as well. So without further ado, Nanjala, we welcome you to the stage.
I know you were told that. Ooh. Can you hear me? I know you were told that this session is going to be in English, but I want to start with a Kiswahili lesson. So, does that still work? When I say tuko pamoja, which means are we together, you say ndio, which means yes. So, ndio. Try. Ndio. If we're not together, you can say hapana, ha-pa-na. Try. Hapana, which means we're not together. Okay? So, tuko pamoja. Okay. I'm going to take your word for it. As I speak, as we go through the conversation, I'm going to invite you to take a second to check in with yourself, make sure we're still on the same page, and if I've left anybody behind, just let me know, and I'll come back and pick you up on the road, because knowledge is a process of co-creation. We are here to bring our offerings together and to see what we can put together for the benefit of everybody in this room and everybody who is beyond this room. As you heard, my name is Nanjala Nyabola. I do very many things. I'm here in my capacity as a researcher. And I want to begin by situating my conversation in the real world, in events that have happened over the last 3 months. What if I told you that everything that we've seen in the last 3 months with the creation of non-consensual sexual images on social media, with the threat of financial collapse from large tech companies and contagion for everybody else, with the normalization of systemic violence against women and children and the exploitation of the natural environment, what if I told you that none of this is accidental, but is actually built into the philosophical foundations of the way our digital lives have been organized over the last 30 years? If I made that argument even 10 years ago, you might have looked at me like I was crazy, because we were all so enthusiastic about how tech was going to save us. But now, in 2026, we're seeing headline after headline that something has happened on the path to our shared digital future, whereby we're being told that things are inevitable only to be withdrawn 3 months later because people resisted. We're being told that technology has to be profitable at tremendous scale in order for it to be worthwhile to invest in. And we're being told that violence against women especially, but violence against gender and sexual minorities as well, is an acceptable cost to pay for the price, it's an acceptable price for technological development and innovation. I only have 30 minutes to convince you that a different digital future is possible. My academic background, I would say that I'm a little bit of an intellectual vagabond. There's a little bit of law, as you heard there. There's a little bit of politics. There's a little bit of philosophy, a little history. But all of this really begins with a desire to understand why. I started by thinking about digital technology not as the apps or the platforms, but as part of the political fabric of my country, Kenya, and indeed the rest of the world. What was it that was instigating change in the society, but what was it also about the society that made specific developments go one way and not the other way? And as I was thinking about this work, by default, I found myself centering on the experiences of women. Those of you who have read Digital Democracy, which is my first book, it might not be obvious because it is a political book and is a political text, but you might have noticed that it does privilege the voices and experiences of women over those of men. Partly it was because I was the one who was thinking the book, and I was the one who was writing the book, and I was writing about communities that I was in. I was writing about how women had organized after the election violence to document election violence to advocate for change. I was writing about the Justice for movements, which were using social media to demand accountability for sexual and gender violence. I was writing about women raising money for other women and for other people in the community because the traditional systems for finding safety and for finding support had broken. It was a little bit of a default, but then when I got to the political chapter, I started to think of myself, what does Kenyan politics look like when we don't have to talk about Raila, and we don't have to talk about Uhuru Kenyatta, and we don't have to talk about all of these men who have been at the center of our political imaginary for the last 25 years. In thinking with women's experience, it wasn't just about women as disempowered subjects, as recipients of technology who then adapt to it. It was thinking about the agency, the creativity, the innovation that lies in how women use technology to define their social and political reality. This work culminated in a lot of books, in a book and a lot of papers, but I was still left with the question, why? Why were some of the ways that women in Kenya were viewing and using technology so obvious to us as Kenyan women, but so elusive to other people? Why was it so logical for us and so surprising to others? And I'll give you an example. There was a study in 2016 that was looking at how market women, so the tiers in the market, would use mobile money to fund their daily operations. At the time, commercial banks were very reluctant to lend money to people who didn't have assets that they could secure loans against. So by 2007, only 27% of adults in Kenya had access to a bank account. What these women were doing was borrowing money in the morning, trading with it all day, and then repaying the loan by the evening. Because the interest rates on these loans, once you go past the 24-hour cycles, they are ridiculous. They can go up to 34%. 34% APR is predatory. So it is in your best interest to make sure that the loan is cleared by the end of the day and then do it all over again the next day. Also, in Kenya, debt carries a lot of social stigma. You don't want to be the person who is carrying the debt with you over a long period of time, at least not publicly. But the women had found a workaround. They borrowed in the morning, they traded all day, they repaid the debt in the evening, and they did it again the next day. No debt, no interest, no stigma. Tuko pamoja? Tuko pamoja? Better. From a capitalist perspective, this is really infuriating because it means the company doesn't actually make any money from this process. Maybe a small transaction fee. But if we were to apply the logic of innovation without embedding it in a capitalist framework, without adding this idea that maximizing profit is what makes innovation worthwhile, we see this as an incredible example of agency and creativity. And in fact, there's so many examples of these similar micro-innovations across Africa's digital terrain. Yet women are using digital technologies, often those that are not designed with them in mind, to build different social and political realities. And those innovations, those changes, those ideas have an impact on how everybody uses technology. And that leads me to the substance of my talk today. As I said, something really bad has happened on this road to our shared digital future. We've accepted that it's okay that the largest, or what they want us to call the public sphere, that it's okay that people can generate non-consensual sexual images of people, and the penalty being that you get to pay for the privilege to do it, that it's not a criminalized offense. We've accepted that when women report abuse and threats of harm, that the response is to tell them, just ignore it. Just ignore it. It's part of the cost of being in the public eye. Let me do a quick survey of this room. When you heard about deepfake technology, when you read the first time about deepfake technology, how many people had a positive reaction to it? How many people thought this is fantastic? Right? Every single person that I know who had a positive reaction to it was, amen. We're gonna make films, we're gonna do Sora, and we're gonna do that. Every single woman that I know, and I don't know if this is the same in your circle, thought, this is going to be used to hurt women. And so it has been. At the same time, think about the question of labor. Whose work makes our shared digital future possible? When we think of tech workers, we often think of highly paid computer engineers in fancy offices, coding and building models. But behind most, if not all, of the major technological developments that we're celebrating today is a class of unpaid, lowly paid, exploited labor in what are in effect sweatshops. And many of these are in my country, Kenya. These workers train, they clean up AI models, they do content moderation, they subject themselves to hours and hours of the ugliest and most violent content that human beings are able to produce, because without them, the platforms, the AI, the digital tech that many of us take for granted would turn dangerous and even useless in a matter of days. Does anybody here remember Microsoft's Tay? When Microsoft launched a AI LLM on Twitter that was supposed to be posting as a person, and it became racist in 2 days. Literally 2 days, it was unusable. Without this class of underpaid workers, this illusion of progress is simply not possible. Amazon Go was supposed to be the future of shopping. You walk in, you pick out your goods, and you walk out. Turns out to be a lot of low-wage workers in India watching surveillance cameras, making sure that people aren't stealing. Every time your automated car, your self-driving car is unable to find its way out of traffic, some gig worker has to go on a bicycle in San Francisco, make sure that the car switched on and is put right. Otherwise, people end up sitting in traffic for hours on end. The self-delivery robots that are all over the streets of San Francisco, there is a class of gig workers who has to go and make sure that they're not stuck somewhere, that they're not blocking the road somewhere, that there's something that is not working the way in which it was promised that can be rectified. Digital technologies do not happen in the cloud. There is human labor at every level that makes it possible, and yet these workers are often poorly compensated and rarely acknowledged. I think more importantly, or just as importantly, is the material reality of our shared digital future. I think the most successful magic trick that's happened in the last 25 years is that we've become convinced that our digital lives are somehow disconnected to the physical reality of the planet. It's hard enough to get people to think about digital infrastructure, cables and fiber optic cables and modems and semiconductors and all of that. It's hard enough to get people to pay attention to the 200 mine workers who died in a coltan mine collapse in the DRC last month. That is also part of our digital future. That is the material that goes into the batteries that go into our electrical vehicles. Harder still is getting people to understand that the queries that they're running through ChatGPT to create images that will be transient, that they will not think about after that moment, consume half a liter of water every single time. That the air pollution in data centers is as bad as being a smoker for several years, and that these data centers are being deliberately placed within poor communities to exacerbate the racial, the economic inequalities that already exist. In exchange for the promise of ease, we've accepted a complete disconnect from the fact that the cloud is a data center in a poor community that is contributing to the climate crisis. Tuko pamoja? All right. I don't think that these and other negative outcomes can be fixed without asking radical questions. And I'm using the word radical here in the way in which one of my favorite activists, Ella Baker, who was very critical to the civil rights movement in the US, a woman whose work very poorly acknowledged, but when the students of this Student Nonviolent Central Committee, SNCC, needed to eat, it was Ella who had to figure out where the food was. She was the one who made sure that Martin Luther King Jr. always had a place to sleep. Always wrote, and she wrote speeches, and she was very smart and very passionate, but most people don't know who she is. Ella Baker urges us to think radically about social change, and radical here means to the root. Let's get down to the root of what the issue is here. I don't think that these are superficial questions about how or methodology, but I think these are more fundamental questions about ontologies and epistemologies. They're philosophical questions about the sources of our ethics. In my research, I argue that these outcomes come about because the person at the center of our imagination of what digital technology is and what it's for is a person who we imagine that this person, the purpose of this person's existence is to consume the natural environment, to ensure their individual survival, to maximize their capacity to extract. It's not just about capitalism. It's about this imagination that modernity, that the future means being alienated from the natural environment, not being part of the world, but living on the world, taking from the world, naming, ordering, subjecting, surviving, and then exiting without having to think about what the next generation will have to live with once you're done. I started this research thinking about how African women use their agency to define their relationship with power, not just with digital technologies, but with society and politics more broadly. And when I started to see all of these different outcomes, I was asking myself, why? Why does this woman put the survival of her community ahead of the survival of herself? She doesn't have to take on all of this risk. Why does the Tia brave arrest, brave being detained, all of that to make sure that the community survives, even though it causes her material harm? I started to look at the specific writings and teachings of African women because the intersectionality of these identities, African, woman, modernity, has produced a rich body of work where this group of people has spent years writing against orthodoxy and producing new ways of thinking about our world. So I'm thinking about women like Sylvia Tamale. Sylvia Tamale is a Ugandan lawyer. She just retired from Makerere University and spent most of her career critically interrogating modern law in Uganda. I don't know if there are any other lawyers in the room. Are there any other lawyers in the room? Good, save yourself. In law, we have this concept we call the reasonable man. The standard in criminal law for finding someone culpable for a crime is that, how would a reasonable man behave? And it is man. How would a reasonable man behave in this circumstance? So if someone commits murder, the difference between manslaughter and capital murder is, how would a reasonable man respond to this set of circumstances? In the common law, for example, if a man walked in and found his wife in bed with another man and he killed both of them, you would say, well, a reasonable man would probably be upset about that. Let's give him manslaughter. But for women, especially women who kill partners, women in abusive relationships who kill their partners, the penalty was almost always harsh. A reasonable man, quote unquote, would have left, right? It is women like Sylvia and feminist scholars all over the world who have been doing extensive research that has proven why this standard is broken. Because for women, the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is the moment that she declares an intention to leave. That is where a woman is most likely to be killed by an abusive partner. And that is why a lot of women stay in abusive relationships even though they know it is not for their benefit. So what does the law on murder look like when our central referent object, our I, is not a reasonable man, but a reasonable woman, or a child, or a person who has lived through generations of racial and gender inequality? Would the decision-making be the same, and therefore would the punishments be the same? When I looked at Sylvia's work on the customary law, what you see is someone who is trying to shift this fundamental assumption of who the subject of the law is. Customary law is a body of law that everybody says, well, this is how our ancestors always did it. We have customary law, we have common law in a lot of African countries. But Sylvia says, well, customary law is actually a product of an agreement between elite colonial men and elite African men. And it doesn't actually seem to serve African women at all. African women were economic agents before colonization. They were farmers, they did all of these things, and customary law says, well, only men can inherit land. Only men can do certain jobs. These are the kind of subversions that are made possible when we shift the central referent object of our imaginary. Who is the I at the center? I wanted to extend this practice to the way in which our imaginary of digital technology is constructed. What if the I at the center of our tech imaginary was not some dude coding in California who, when something goes wrong, he can go to the cops and the cops will believe him. He can complain and someone will listen. What if the I at the center of our imaginary was someone who was already marginalized socially, economically? What kind of tech would we build? What kind of ethical questions would we ask? Where would we put our energy and our efforts? What would we celebrate as innovation? I make this point by going back to the example, or rather, since before our countries have existed, African women have had to write themselves into our stories of politics, society, and economics. And this is the body of work that I'm calling African feminism. It's focused on justice, equality, and freedom, looking at what they're told exists and saying, how does this actually look when your experience is different, has produced what I argue is a rich body of knowledge that can offer us a wildly different shared digital future. I'll make this point by going back to the example of the environmental consequences of generative AI. Even today, the majority of African women are subsistence farmers. They spend a lot of time close to the land, dependent on the land for their survival. African feminists spend a lot of time challenging economic orthodoxy, in which the purpose of the economy is to secure the lives of those who live in cities, those who live in urban contexts, and to think broadly about, well, what does this look like for those who remain close to the land? Professor Wangari Maathai, who was the first and so far the only African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, spent her entire working life arguing that there could be no social or economic progress without protection of the earth, and that our economic models must think about interdependence with the natural environment in order to be valid. You can't build, break, and then come back and say, well, now let's fix the relationship with nature. If the relationship with nature is not there from the beginning, then the model is broken from the beginning. The idea that something can be built without contemplating its environmental consequences is completely antithetical to the ethical commitments of African feminism. So this Gen AI that's being developed and deployed to great fanfare already has a problem from the beginning, because it is severing the connection between the human and the natural environment. In the same way that you wouldn't consider a car complete if it didn't have an engine, we shouldn't consider an innovation complete if we haven't thought through its environmental consequences. Tuko pamoja? This side of the room is a bit less enthusiastic, but I'll get you the next round. This is just one example or two examples of a larger body of work that make a core point. We need radically different sources of knowledge about how we organize our digital lives if we want radically different outcomes. It's not just about representation. It's not just about putting women into systems that are designed to fail them, or putting African women into systems that are designed to consume and exploit them. It's about going back to the roots. What would be different? It's about ethical debates that really examine what the role of the human is today, what the impact of our choices today will be on future generations. Different ethical frameworks produce different ethical outcomes. And we have to be bold enough to look beyond orthodoxy, to look beyond received wisdom to ask ourselves, what else might be possible? I like to think about it as a potato. Do you like potatoes? I love a potato. I've eaten a lot of potatoes this week. In most of the world, when I say potato, we think about the Irish potato, yes? The one that we use to make chips and we use to make mash. We are so conditioned about the fact that the Irish potato is the potato that we don't even question it. But here in South America, which gave the world the potato, in neighboring Peru, I saw this article in the Smithsonian, there are 3,000 varieties of potato. 3,000 varieties of potato, and we've been eating probably the least nutritious one. Our ideas of what the potato is, what can be done with a potato, should not be limited by an unwillingness to engage with each other beyond the lines of difference. We shouldn't allow our imaginations of what ethical futures are possible for our digital lives. We shouldn't allow that imagination to be limited by an unwillingness to engage with new sites of knowledge, new sites of possibilities, new sites of engagement. Our ideas of what ethical frameworks should guide our shared digital future should be guided by our willingness to think together, to think with each other, to think alongside each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Nanjala, which are something that we so desperately need to hear in our moment, I think. Should I go to this microphone?
Test,
Closer, test. Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. There's so much that was resonant in what you said, but I think from a systems perspective, starting at the top, I think about the 5 whys technique. How do we get to the root causes? Yeah. And in this moment where we feel panic and pressure, so many of our things go to the top level. And as I heard you speak, you kept drilling down. And it's only when we drill all the way down that we reach that space of truly radical possibility. I'll give you some examples, and I also want to get out of the way quickly here because we have about 15 minutes appointed for audience questions. But I'll offer some thoughts, maybe to stir the pot just a little bit here, because full disclosure, I, like you, have a background in law.
There was another lawyer.
Yeah. I don't always admit it. It's kind of like in the 21st century, we're all told data is the new oil, but it's usually someone else extracting it, right? So, as we think about what to do, I think we need this space for radical reconsideration. And part of that is creating imaginative spaces that we can beckon people to move into, such that from the standpoint of environmental economics and law, they don't feel that they're losing an entitlement or giving something up. That's one challenge. The 5 whys perspective, I think about one answer to that could be the 7 generations perspective. If we think about this in an indigenous American framework, this is another thing that I struggle with and would love to hear your thoughts, that it's very hard to get to connect with someone who has the YOLO attitude, I'm living my life, I have to get through this, and to say, well, what about 7 generations from now? What looks best there? And my wonderful colleagues in InfoCitizen, Alexandra, Guilherme, I look around the room, we often have these conversations. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that. And then I want to say one last thing about, we're sort of flipping this on its head. To your point, if you look at the history of information technologies, new technologies, we could go back to the photograph. They're almost immediately in a world of men, turned towards pornography and warfare. So if you understand history, you see these events and you go, well, here it comes. But why isn't that more broadly understood? I think if we flip this on its head, we are already so inured and accepting of a digital world in its current mold that people scoff at it. Let's think about your 10-year comment. What if we said we can actually create a world online, a digital world in which children would be safe and welcome, where a parent would say, we want our children to go there. What we have might be the absolute opposite of that at the moment, but why would we accept that? And how would we design that, or even think about designing it without centering the voices of women and people at the margins? I've always been a dreamer, and between the ideal and the real falls the shadow. But I think this is a very tenuous and important moment where people can actually say, you know what, this isn't working. It's having catastrophic consequences. So I would love to just put those opening provocations out there and continue to drill down and maybe even think about things like what's ridiculed and then becomes accepted. We could think about, and obviously if you think about empowerment groups, like now we have a body of earth law that says, well, what if ecosystems had rights? Now, of course, this is before we even reach women and children and others. So anyhow, this idea, I love what you're saying. I would love to hear more about how we open up those imaginative spaces in ways that are welcoming and resonate with others.
Thank you. I've been working on this specific question for the last 4 years, which is, for a long time, I think I started digital rights work like maybe 10 years ago, and maybe 12. And what my experience of it was that we kept going from crisis to crisis to crisis. Something would happen and then we would have to mobilize about that. Something would happen and we'd have to organize. And there was never any space for imagination. And that was really the genesis of this project for me, was if you had all the power and you had all the resources and you had all the time in the world, what principles would you use to build your tech reality? Like how would you organize it? What would people be doing? And I think this is like that moment of opening up. Is really, I hope that this work is like an opening up of saying, first of all, the first thing that we need to do is to invite more people into the spaces in which some of these conversations and determinations are made. You talked about the people for whom this might, the loss of privilege, they might experience this as loss, right? But at the same time, there's also this critical mass of people who don't know that they're invited to these conversations. Yes. They don't know that when you talk to like African women in tech, for example, and I know quite a few, and they think that the way in which that's why I call the talk Beyond Representation, that the thing to do to make a change is to simply be present. But if you're present in a system that is actively conspiring against you, you're not doing anything. You're participating in your own destruction. And so I think for me that's what's the starting point is we have to find a way to invite more people into this conversation. And I'm also very careful to make sure that people understand I'm not a tech pessimist or a tech optimist. I like to think of myself as a tech realist. And the reality is there's a distinction between the infrastructure, there's a difference between the internet and the platforms that we use to connect to the internet, and data and the companies that handle our data. Those are distinct things. And I think part of it is we have to do the imaginative work of naming things properly and putting things in their proper place. This is generational work. This is not something that I think I'm going to resolve. It might not even be resolved in this particular period, even though it is urgent and necessary now. But that's another thing that I take from all of this African feminist work. There was no reason for people who lived under colonization to believe that they would be free. You know, Ursula Le Guin tells us, she's a great science fiction writer, capitalism is not inevitable. At one point, people also thought the divine right to rule was inevitable. And in the same way, people who organized for decolonization, people who organized for the civil rights movement, people who organized for all of these things, they had no reason to believe that they would ever be free. From that particular belief, what I take is we look at the crises that are embedded in our digital reality today, and it might feel overwhelming, but this is generational work that invites us to imagine that a different way is possible, that an internet where children can learn and play and grow and not have to be protected from predators, and women don't have to worry about that. It is possible, but we cannot capitulate to that imagination almost in advance. I think I've kind of answered all three questions. Oh, and I also wanted to emphasize the 3,000 potatoes. This is not a search for total theory, and this is another really important distinction that is a really important philosophical distinction. I think in a lot of the dominant sort of Western philosophical model, the idea is that we are doing research to find the theory that explains all the things. And one of the best things about operating or working outside that dominant frame is that multiple theories can coexist. Multiple things can have explanatory power. I've learned so much from how Maori people are thinking about data sovereignty. And as we were in Mare this last week, this is something that I think has a lot of resonance, that the Maori approach to data sovereignty is that the data is not owned by the individual, it is owned by the community. So you can't sell it, I can't sell it, but we might be able to come to some agreement. The government can't just come and take it. It has to be engaged in this process of deliberation and things like that. And when I see the work that's being done in Mare, the mappings, the surveys and the censuses and things like that, I was thinking that's another layer that might be worth thinking about. At what point how do we make sure that the sense of community carries through to the level of ownership and operationalization of data? There's so much cool thinking that is happening out there through the frame of resistance. And what I'm hoping this work does is to say, let's open up the space a little bit more for some of these conversations.
Yeah.
Have I answered everything? Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay.
That's a lot to cover. And
so much.
I'm connecting the many thoughts that your talk raised. Thinking about the example of the potato, I was involved in rediscovering some apple varieties in the United States, which I did with my students. One of the first things that happened was the university said, well, why don't we trademark that? Why don't we take the intellectual property? And the argument was, this was never ours, right? Yeah. And when it is someone's, it should be credited. Yeah. So I think this natural and human history example is critical. I also want to point out that 5-10 years ago, you were thinking about what's now broadly recognized as our poly crisis. If you think about leading threats of climate change, information integrity, and also violence and partisanship. And your point that these are not accidents, that these are indeed deeply related phenomena, needs underscoring. Because I think, again, from a 5 whys perspective, we treat them as separate, as opposed to. But I would like to maybe see if we can, I don't know if we have questions coming in online as well, but let's get the questions from our audience going while we still have time. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Nanjala. Thank you, Brian. We're also going to open now for questions. I know that we also have online participation and a few comments as well. So if you want to make a question or if you want to make a comment as well, I'll just ask for you to be briefly and also to introduce yourself as soon as you make the question.
No questions. Oh, we fixed the internet. Yes. I'm gonna go home.
Work is done.
Work is done.
Yeah.
Yep.
Bom dia, meu nome é Gisele.
Good morning, my name is Giselle.
São Paulo, do
I'm
Brasil.
from São Paulo, I'm from Brazil.
Queria fazer comentário.
And I wanted to make a comment.
Para nós é muito importante
Because
aqui na
to
América
us,
Latina dizer que a
It's very
batata
important in Latin America to say that potatoes are from South America. I'm just joking. But
comentar aqui
I wanted
essa
to say
questão
that
da segurança de dados
this
é um
issue
debate
on data
bem
security
importante,
is a
né,
very
dessa,
important debate
como os dados têm sido
on how
usados.
data
No Brasil, a gente tem
have been
eleitoral.
used. And in
Esse
Brazil, we
ano,
have elections
provavelmente
this year.
o primeiro ano
Probably it will be the first year when the fake videos are going to be used. We have a funny people, so to speak. We have this meme showing that all around the world people are concerned about AI, while in Brazil we use that for fun. But the perception of violence against women and black population is also very strong. And we are also dealing with the fact that it's very hard to convince people that we shouldn't make that something natural. We have some imaginary experiences. We have this artist who is in Rio. His name is Guilherme Bretas, and he has this exhibition here, and he's been working with imagination, using AI to think this ancestor imagination. So I wanted to ask about other experiences where AI is used in a way to produce that, if there's a possibility about that.
Reforçando a sua hegemonia.
Or if it's only reinforcing its hegemonic aspect.
Sure. I'm always very intentional about saying that there are use cases for me. This whole week, I don't know how I would have gotten by without Google Translate. Like, it's made so many conversations possible. It's made so many interactions possible because I don't really speak Portuguese. So I'm not one of those people who is unilateral in my declarations. I think, though, that one of the things, when people do things like that, using images or using AI to recreate people who were alive, who, I think it's thinking deeper about what violence means. I think it's thinking deeper about, and again, this whole natural environment piece of it as well. I think it's more that, for me, it's if you can do all of these things, if you can build something that cares for that doesn't harm the natural environment, maybe even enhances it, that doesn't create this possibility of harm, that doesn't create this generational, because future generations have to live on this planet, you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. The problem that we have now is that people aren't even thinking about those questions. So these positive use cases are being used to sanitize a lot of really profound harms. You know, when they tell you, this morning I think the OpenAI announced that they were shutting down Sora, and they were also shutting down their adult-only chatbot. Which, you know, my God. But, you know, they're not even pushing themselves. And so the people who are doing things like that are all over the promotional materials, all over the narrative that's being used to paper over the other 90%, 80% of things that are happening. So for me, it's not about, is this a good use, is this a bad use? It's really more about the systemic questions. Have we built a system, a structure in which the good uses, the positive uses, are not being used to cover up all of this really horrendous stuff that's happening on the side? And if we haven't, you know, we need to go back to the drawing board a little bit more. Maybe these things are raw potatoes. Maybe they're just not cooked yet, and you need to go back to the drawing board. So, yeah, I worry about things like that being used to hide all of this other stuff, so that we're all talking about this and nobody's paying attention to who, as I said, many of these people are in Kenya. This cleanup crew, we have a generation of young in the Philippines, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, who were promised good tech jobs, who are going through horrible mental health crisis, because by the time you are able to produce that short video, someone has had to sit through 18 hours of really terrible stuff to make sure that when you make that video, the terrible stuff doesn't show up in that video too. So yeah, it's just thinking about that relationality and that interconnectivity that I would emphasize.
Thank you for the question.
First of all, thank you very much for this talk. It's deeply moving. And I miss a lot those potatoes from Colombia too. So thank you for saying that too. But I was thinking when you talked about how we situate the profile, let's say, of the person who's supposed to use those AI or those technology, how that is for me linked to the concept that I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of universal. Because the universal came with colonization, right? So it was the colonization that brought the fact that there is one unique version for all of us. And so it made us believe that universal is the white European or global North man. And then you go and see that most things are built around that. And which really frightens me is not that it's built around that, but it's like it's perpetuating the idea that that is what we all should go towards, right? And then when you see those AIs that clean your face from pores, or you know, or make your skin lighter, or those things, we do not understand, or we are not fully aware of the impact on how that is perpetuating these universal narratives to our new generations. I have a son. So I think that as long as whoever is in the center of that universalism doesn't move from the center, it's very hard to reach that center, because also, as we saw in previous conferences, tech corporations like Amazon or Google are also involved being military contractors. And so they're just not getting the money from the tech, but they're getting the money from the war. So it's just like, there is a link of that male universalism there. So have you thought, all this to ask, have you thought if there is any way in which we can try to overthrow that universalism and be able to actually or create some technological tools, to create new versions of more universes and not just one, without, and this is what it makes it, without going to what Carolina was saying, going to the people who's like doubting science,
exactly.
and now creating anti-vaccines and saying that science, because that's the universal Western way of thinking. So
Absolutely.
I think that's like a dangerous path, and I don't know if you have thought about it.
I have. That's actually one of the big challenges, is how do you...
Como você reconhece o que é útil, o que é significativo? E eu volto a essa ideia da teoria total. Resistir a essa ideia da teoria total, até mesmo quando você faz pesquisa.
Review, a lot of the times our orientation is that the purpose of literature review is to say what's wrong with what everybody else has done. And I don't think that has to be the case. A literature review could also be a celebration of what is right with what everybody else has done and what I'm adding to what everybody else has done. And I think that's the difference between this whole total theory approach and this, it's called ontological pluralism. Just recognizing that the purpose of generating knowledge is not the exclusion of other forms of knowledge, including sort of this Western philosophical model. It's really saying, how do we create a space where plurality is possible? Another example that I would think of is the way language and AI have interacted with each other. When people started to do these projects to document languages, preserve languages and things, that is actually I think that's a really great use of the internet. That there are so many languages that are getting lost of digital technology. There's so many languages that are getting lost. There's so many people who never get a chance to learn their language. And I think that's a really great example of how digital technology can be used to preserve culture, to do something positive. But what's happened since then? And this is where this sort of masculinist-centered consumptive thing came in. It became property. Our words became property. This thing that we do is now owned by, and you can't use it to do this because they'll tell you you can't, So there was a window there where something beautiful was being done. People were volunteering to do translations for free. People were offering because they had this spirit of Ubuntu and all of these things, and they went and they built this beautiful, the Quechua language was really one of the great examples of how people use the internet to preserve, to teach, to expand. And then the tech companies came in and said, well, now we're going to buy these platforms, and you're going to have to interact with them through this commercial perspective. So for me, that's a great example of exactly what you're saying. I'm not saying that everybody get rid of, although I really should be on my phone less. I'm not saying everybody get rid of your phone. I'm not an anti-tech person, and I don't think that's a productive way to be. There are things that have happened that digital technology has made possible. What I'm criticizing is exactly what you said. Underneath that, the why. Why this way and not that way? Why does it have to become property? Why does it have to distort our relationship with nature? Let's do the hard work of building the better thing. That, I think, is the ultimate invitation. Let's do the hard work of building the better thing, because we only have one planet and we all are stuck on it as much as they try to escape. And we might as well do the hard work instead of the short-term thing. Does that answer your question? Okay, great.
Thank
also,
you.
Go ahead, Guillermo.
No, please.
I was just connecting a few dots. One of the really striking insights you shared earlier was this connection between the virtual and the real, and how we're displacing things. So I was thinking about your very insightful comment, Sylvie, and then, what is the skin whitener of our time?
It's the filter.
It is the filter, right? And we saw, for example, virtual reality initially deployed in a way that could invite people to empathetic experiences, to get outside of their bubble. But the psychology of it is so important because the algorithm and its manipulators know that psychology very well, the psychology of outrage and attention.
Yes.
So I think, again, if we go back to the whys, like then we begin to be in a place where we can reconceive. And similarly, there is one universal, apart from the ones we all know, like doing unto others as you might wish to be done unto you. But the Rawls theory of justice, for example, if you didn't know what society you would be born into, you would have a vested interest in saying, well, what about this person, that person, you know, and that might be a more useful, if we're going to talk about universalisms, the veil of ignorance. If we embrace humility and ignorance as we start a design process, we might get a better result.
Absolutely.
Tying all these different
together.
observations together. But Guilherme, there's another question back there, I believe. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I think since we're a bit ahead of the time, I would just suggest for us to collect a few more questions. And I know it's a bit challenging, Anjala, but perhaps just wrapping up as well. And I'm sure that we still have time to do that during the lunch, and we can continue this discussion today and tomorrow. So I'll just emphasize also for us to have more participation, just to shorten the questions a bit, and also to introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Professor Nanjala, for bringing some of your perspectives on innovation and feminist resistance. My name is Isabel. I am a designer of the Marielle Franco Dictionary, an initiative of the training of technology and health at the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation, and this project has the purpose of preserving memory and collective identities of residents of favelas and urban peripheries. I am a resident here at the Penha community. I'm part of the IT team. And I found your speech very interesting because the basis of our platform is an open code. It was an ethical and political choice of ours of not depending on big techs or any other proprietary technology. We have a platform called Wiki Favelas that is based on Media Wiki. It is mostly accessed by young women. And I would like to know a little bit more about how the women in their studies and in the perspective of African feminism, how women have used open code technologies, for example, to resist in the digital world. If they have projects, how have they appropriated these open code technologies? Do you have any case that could give us an example to share with us and other initiatives from Africa? Thank you very much.
I'm just going to go over here.
Thank you, Nanjala. I'm very moved by the talk, and I think it's the very first time I've heard you speaking, even after following your work for very many years. So I think one thing that stood out for me in your talk is the idea that we need to invite more people into the space, but also the realization that, I mean, a shared digital future doesn't have to be a technical one alone. I mean, there's spaces for all people from all backgrounds. And I think for me, it's the question around how do we break the digital monoculture, right? You talk about, creating space for imagination, and as someone who has been working with communities, diverse communities, trying to talk to people about, a safe digital future, people that don't even speak English yet the internet is full in English. I mean, we have several dialects in Uganda, for example. And there's dialects that you can't even come close to finding on the internet. So I wanted to ask about, what feminist pedagogies have you seen work, to sort of spark that imagination for people to be able to ask the radical questions like you suggested?
Thank you, Philip. I'm afraid we're going to have to just shorten a bit, but yeah, so those are the questions, and
okay.
Feel free to answer them.
Sure. I think actually the answer kind of is both answers to both questions. So the last project that I did before I did this was what I call the Kiswahili Digital Rights Project. And that was trying to put all of these ideas into practice. So we were doing a lot of advocacy around what is called the Huduma number, which is a single source of truth identity number that was launched by the Kenyan government. And it was launched in a very violent way. It was trying to collect a lot of identifying data about everybody who is over the age of 6 in the country. But then it was trying to combine it with databases that they would just completely violate the constitutional right to privacy. So around the census, which was 2019, they were going around asking people, because they come to your house when they're doing the census. The census was collecting geolocation, your house down to, I think it was like 6 decimal points specific, and then they were connecting that with your identifying information, with your Huduma number. So there would be this one database that basically knew where you were and things like that. And this is why I always ask the deeper why questions and the fundamental questions. Because if you have a positive relationship with the government, you might hear that and think, yeah, well, the government's going to use it for good things. I'm Kenyan. I do not have a positive relationship with my government. Every single piece of legislation that has been passed in Kenya for digital security, for digital safety, has first and foremost been used to threaten the safety of critics of the state. Every last one, the Computer Cybercrimes Act, the Data Privacy Act, the first target is always people who are critical of the state. In Kenya, if you steal someone's phone, if you steal someone's car, they'll show you the CCTV and say, tough, that's tough break. But if you tweet something that is critical of the government, they will show up at your house, they will pick you up, they will drive you across the country, right? And you end up in a police station that is in a different constituency from where you actually had dinner the night before. And some people end up dead. Do you want that government to know your phone number, your kids' names, down to 6, what you do for work, how much money you make, So we were asking, how is it that you don't have money to pay teachers, but you have money to roll out this 60 billion shilling data system? And the origins, when we were doing the advocacy, and some of my colleagues are here, when we were doing advocacy around the Huduma number, one of the things that came up is we didn't have the words for a lot of the things that we were doing. There was no word for privacy in Swahili. There was no word for surveillance in Swahili. They had all of these digital conversations that were happening in English, and we were saying, but it's your right too. But we couldn't tell people, we couldn't explain these things because all of the concepts had been deployed in English. And that's where you would say things like, privacy ni kitu muhimu sana. Surveillance ni kitu mbaya sana. Oh, what? What does that mean? And so when we did the Kiswahili Digital Rights Project, it was an open source initiative to provide translation for key terms in digital rights, and specifically in digital rights, not digital technology more broadly. And one of the first things that happened when we ended up doing playing cards instead of putting something, there is an online version, but we did playing cards because we handed them out to high school kids for free so that they would have entertainment when they're in their dorms and things like that. But that they would also, it's also like it's like a language card. On one side, it explains the term in English, on the other side, it explains the term in Kiswahili. So they would be able to use it as a learning tool. And we handed them out for free. And we did workshops in schools. Unfortunately, I had to stop because I had to go start this other project. But it was a great lesson in open source, sharing information. And I kid you not, almost as soon as we launched, the first thing was, I think it was Mozilla, no, it was Google something. Can we buy this from you? Are you going to patent it? Can we turn this into, and I had to say no multiple times because the intention was always to give it away. Let people use it, let people build from it, let people reorganize it. Now there's an isiZulu version, there's a Somali version, there's all of these things, and I said, I don't want control. Do whatever you want. There is a logic there that we were trying to resist, this capitalist logic that language can be owned, language can be monetized, and things like that, but also recognizing that people were experiencing they were experiencing their digital future in translation, that they weren't really invited to the conversation because the words and the language just really didn't exist. And my hypothesis was always, if we gave people the language, maybe the arguments, maybe they would build this, maybe they would build something else. Mm-hmm. And the best example that I always think is what happened with the Gen Z protests. Because in the Gen Z protests, we had all of these young people translating the finance bill into every single language, volunteering to do all of that. That's the impact that language has on political possibility. The reason why you had this massive mobilization in Kenya, 45 out of 47 countries registered anti-finance bill protests, never been seen in the country's history, because of all this voluntary work that people were doing in the background to make sure that people understood the implications of the legislature. And I think that's why I think language translation has to be a key part of inviting people in. It can't be an afterthought. I have an essay coming out that has this title, that's why it's on my mind. A word is not a glacier. It's not just floating out in the open sea. It's actually anchored to how people order the world, how people see their position in the world, what they think is possible. And as long as our default of our digital experiences is for people to experience it in translation, the horizons of the rights conversation will always be constrained. I think I've answered both questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Nanjala. And with that, we end this first keynote, not without giving a warm applause to Nanjala Niabola. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And now, we invite you all to join us outside the auditorium where lunch will be served. But bear in mind that we must come back at 1:15 so we can continue our work today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the questions.